Welcome to In Confidence, where what we share in confidence helps us grow in confidence. Today's episode is all about the 4 generations that are currently in the workplace. Now, we kicked off this season with the idea of trust. Specifically, how do we create environments in our relationships where there's a lot of openness, acceptance, that then funnels up to being congruent and reliable with each other? It's easy to talk about the idea of trust in a vacuum, but I think we have to layer on this idea of building relationships and trust in the workplace on top of the realities of what's happening. For the first time, we have 4 generations in the workplace: boomers, Gen Xers, millennials, and Gen Zers. And I think when you talk about trust, we need to double click on each generation in terms of what they're bringing to the table. I remember someone in my family once saying to me, it takes 2 generations for change to happen. And it was in reference to the Berlin Wall. And what he was saying was, if right after the war, everyone remembered the Berlin Wall, that there was an East Germany and a West Germany. And then past 2 generations, the grandkids and the great-grandkids, after the wall came down, didn't even remember that there was a wall and didn't even think about these barriers. And that was fascinating to me because we have 4 generations now. So we have 2 full cycles of change and history and legacy all sitting inside the same workplace. So how do we build trust? How do we build relationships when we fundamentally have these generational divides? So today's episode is all about how do we think about each generation? What are some common attributes and traits and strengths of those generations? What are some common triggers? I do think that when we can double click on it and understand it, we increase the curiosity, the acceptance, and the openness we create so that trust has a chance to bloom and succeed. So that's what we're going to get into today. I'm going to start off with just a short story before we double click on all of these generations. When I started my company, we had basically 3 out of those 4 generations working at the same time. I had 2 incredible women who'd been in the New York City garment district for 40 years, in their 60s, leading production, leading manufacturing. I had myself, who I call myself half Gen X, half millennial. I was born in 1979. I might describe this as, whenever you get to a state line and you stand on either side of it, you can be in 2 states at the same time. You can be in New Jersey and New York simultaneously. So I like to say I'm a little Gen X, I'm a little millennial. And then we had millennials on the team. We did not have any Gen Zers at that point. And it was fascinating that we all got along. And I wonder if it's because I was raised in an Asian family and there is a deep respect for elders, a deep respect for the work you bring, and a notion of nurturing younger people. I wonder if that's cultural. I'm just saying that for myself, it was. Like, there was a deep respect for elders. So that the 2 women in their 60s, they didn't use computers. They did everything by hand and on boards, and they did production beautifully. And I thought to myself, I have so much to learn. Over the last 40 years, they've seen ups and downs in the apparel business. They've seen offshoring. And I just really want to learn from them because they've made all the mistakes. I don't want to make the same mistakes. And they helped us build our entire manufacturing network out. At the same time, we had myself, another person who were Gen Xers. I think we brought a certain sense of workplace culture. And then we had 2 millennials on the team. And they taught me so much about digital, about things that were happening, cultural relevance and trends. And I think at the beginning, it just really worked because we all had a deep sense of openness, acceptance. Everyone is bringing their strengths to the table. I fast forward to now, we have an intern on our team who is a Gen Zer, and there is just a deep curiosity I have. I always joke that every summer we have summer interns, and they all have to teach me a new piece of slang. And I'm going to get into that a little bit, like what I learned recently. And I think there's a notion of we have the chance to learn from each other. I also know where it can have conflict, where there is a difference in the way we do things and who wins in those decision points and When do you say that's the way things used to be done and that's the way things are done now and this is the way things should be done in the future? I think it's a really fascinating time where we're having a lot of values-based conversation around here's the way it's always been done. Here's the way people do it now, and here's the way it should be done in the forward. I think this is a really exciting time where we can harvest the best of each of these 4 generations to create something special going forward. And that's what I want to talk about is how am I thinking about it? Because we have so many generations involved in our business. And what are some of the triggers that I have seen or anticipate? And I would just love to have a dialogue. Please engage with us on social media or via email inconfidence@gravitasnewyork.com, because I think this is an ongoing context. If we want to build great relationships and trust, what's the foundation of each generation's challenges and strengths that are almost the basis for this conversation? Because we're going to have to tailor those techniques for each person we're trying to build a relationship with. So let's take a first look at the generational overview. Boomers, the birth years are 1946 to 1964. And typically that workplace vibe is described as loyal, structured, and top down, preferring in-person communications and valuing hierarchy. The strengths of this group is institutional knowledge, mentorship, resilience, a sense of strategic thinking. And what we see as the challenges or what to watch for is might resist rapid change. I don't want to be stereotyping, but maybe tech adoption to a certain extent, and can see flexibility as a lack of commitment, right? I feel like I don't want to mislabel it, but there's a deep sense of structure and hierarchy. And what to watch for is, I think this generation is quite nervous about feeling replaced or dismissed. The second generation is Gen X, born 1965 to 1980. So I technically would be here. I have December 1979, literally on the cusp. And this group is known as independent, skeptical, pragmatic. As someone who grew up in the 80s, I think those things are all true. And very self-reliant. I would say this is a group that might be labeled as the middle child of the workplace. The strengths are they are a bridge builder between boomers and millennials, and they are entrepreneurial and pragmatic. I think there's a challenge in that there might be a sense that we're often overlooked, although the 80s and 90s are having a comeback right now. So I don't know how overlooked we are right now in culture, and are quite resistant to being micromanaged. I do think there's an independent streak to my generation. I think what we need to watch out for is essentially a sense of invisibility, like not being seen, and burnout from being this glue generation. The third generation is the millennials, 1981 to 1996. And I always give the millennials credit for like Me Too and a ton of the social change that was rapidly happening over the last decade, because they're collaborative, they're purpose-driven, they're feedback seekers. I think they are digitally fluent because they grew up with phones. I did not grow up with a phone. I didn't get a phone until my first year as a consultant. The strengths are they're very team-oriented, they're innovative, adaptable, mission-aligned. I mean, this is the freelancer gig economy in terms of fluidity. The challenge is incredibly impatient with hierarchy and bureaucracy. There has historically been a perception of entitlement. And what to watch for, I really think this is a group that gets frustrated if their purpose isn't clear, or they're not growing fast enough, or they don't feel like they're making a big enough difference. And then the fourth generation, which is the generation just entering the workplace now, is Gen Zers, 1997 to 2012. Incredibly digitally native, really values authenticity, questions hierarchy. And I think that's really interesting, the diametrically opposed boomers who value hierarchy and structure. And now we have the Gen Zers who are socially conscious, really fluid in communication and roles, value authenticity, don't love hierarchy. and they're bold, they're entrepreneurial, they're really fast learners. I always joke that every intern class has run circles around me. I did not use Excel until my first year on the job. Like, they are just digitally native, incredibly fast. They use AI tools better than I currently do, and they challenge the status quo. I think the challenge, and we were talking about this before this episode, I was talking about this with our chief of staff and our new intern. They prefer asynchronous communication. So texting, Slack, all of those things. I really have challenges with this because I don't think you can read tone in those, but they're really uncomfortable if you pick up the phone and call them. They may lack exposure to traditional workplace norms, but maybe they're challenging them altogether. And I think what you watch for is there's a disengagement if they don't feel included or heard, or a discomfort with hierarchy. And I think this is the generation that really can label something as inauthentic or performative quite quickly and dismiss it. So I just want to dive deep. There's obviously nuances in all of this, right? We're not labeling each of these generations with these traits specifically, but I think it's helpful just to talk about them, because in the process of even processing it for myself, I was able to then understand where it could be easy to have miscommunications or triggers. And before we get there, I love to set the tone around what we've learned from all our work on trust: openness, acceptance, and curiosity. If you bring those three elements to every relationship, you're able to harness the best of each generation. And I like this idea of harnessing the best of each generation, because I think it unlocks so much value when we can put those together with intention rather than focusing on the triggers. So I want to quickly tick through what our thoughts are on what we can learn from each generation, and then get into what I think the triggers are and the conflicts. So for baby boomers, I personally love loyalty, work ethic, following up, following through, taking pride in something even when no one's watching, a sense of long-term vision, and a deep desire to mentor and pass on wisdom and legacy. I would say this is a generation that did not have constant validation. While they might seek achievement and really value external metrics, there wasn't a sense of constant validation. So I feel like they believe their wisdom and legacy is hard fought, hard won. And I love to value it. I have told almost everyone I've worked with or am friends with from this generation, I so appreciate all the learnings. I take a walk 2 to 3 times a week with a gentleman in his 70s who's my neighbor, and we both have dogs. I have a new puppy. He's had many dogs. And he's literally been my mentor to which vet to go to, things to look out for. I've never owned a pet before. And there is so much respect I have for the fact that he's done it so many times. And he gives me a sense of safety and assurance that I'll be able to do this. My dog's getting spayed this week, so we'll see. But he is the person I really lean on, and I really appreciate his wisdom. For Gen Xers, this is mine. I think this is what we can teach others. So this is me. Adaptability. I mean, we've weathered everything. I have weathered analog to digital, multiple world wars, like just recessions, tech booms and busts. I feel like my generation is the middle child because we've seen so many ups and downs from the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and 2010s. So we are the generation that still remembers what a Walkman is. And I did actually have to, my parents would not let me have an auto reverse Walkman. I literally had to rewind the tape if I wanted to listen to it again. There was no auto reverse. Independence and balance. We get things done. We don't overshare when we get it done. We just get it done. And pragmatism. I think we tend to be skeptical and solution oriented. We try to see through the hype. But I do think our generation, given all the bumps along the road, I think we just get the work done. Millennials. I love the millennials. I have learned so much from the millennials around me. This sense of purpose, so much of the time when I was climbing the ladder, it was very much about collecting accolades, and it may have at times felt like a selfish pursuit of my own things. I've really loved this idea around why work should matter and why it should align with our values. But I think all generations can have that. It's not unique to it, but I think it is a characteristic specific to millennials. Feedback culture. I love an open dialogue and not just structured annual reviews and hierarchical things. I think there is an openness to this generation, and inclusion and collaboration. I think there's a sense that the millennials default to a team mentality. And I would say a lot of social change and social movement happened because of the millennials over the last decade. Gen Z. Here's what I think Gen Z can teach me, and I'm still learning. Digital fluency. I mean, every day there's a new thing I don't know in the world of digital. And the bite-sized format in which this generation communicates without losing clarity, I'm in awe of it. I think in 30 seconds, they're able to capture something that might take me 5 minutes to say. And I really love that. I think there's this digital beat, this drum beat that they have that I wish I could have more of. Authenticity over authority. They challenge norms, they create transparency. And I do have to say, one of the things I do is I ask the interns every summer, teach me something that I don't know. And last year it was Riz, and she ate that and left no crumbs. If you don't know what those are, make sure you ask someone who's a Gen Zer what those are. Although I'm now told that they're normalized, that's just how we talk. I'm also told Slay is over, so now I know that. But I learned something new on this idea of authenticity. So my intern, Emerson, this summer taught me what brain rot is, which is when your brain is rotting from social media, and aura farming. Apparently, what I would describe as just very cool, mysterious, awesome people, they have aura. And if you're aura farming, it's a negative term. It means you're farming, you're harvesting for things to try to give yourself aura. So you might do outlandish things or things that might make you cringe, because you think you're getting aura. So that feels incredibly about calling out people when they're being performative or selfish. So I think there is a sense of authenticity that they're seeking. And mental health awareness. Normalizing conversations around burnout, boundaries, being human at work. This one I love. I talked about this on an earlier podcast episode. I went to something where the CEOs of these really prominent companies, they're retired now, or at least one's retired now, talked about you have to work 24/7 if you want to get what you want. And we had on my friend, Dr. Romy, who said, that's fine. That could be your narrative, but that doesn't have to be the only narrative. And I love that Gen Zers who had to weather the pandemic, and millennials too, just in terms of everything changing and burnout, and being able to talk about it and saying, there's more than one path to success. It can be 24/7 for some, but it doesn't have to be. And there are risks to pursuing that 24/7 path. So I believe every generation, from a curiosity and acceptance standpoint, has so much to teach us. If we can just harness that energy from each of them and see them and respect them and value them for what they bring to the table. What's hard is when they come into conflict, and what one person sees as direct, someone else might see as rude. What someone might call efficient, another might see as lazy or cutting corners. I think there's a lot of tension in terms of perception. And as opposed to solving every single conflict, I thought what we could do is take a trigger that might happen for a generation and double click on why that might be happening. I think this is, my friend Jane calls it, when you're curious and you ask why, you have empathy, you seek to understand, and it doesn't become a barrier to you building a relationship. It helps you sit inside their shoes, understand what's happening, and then you can turn the page to actually collaborating and get the most out of that relationship. So I thought we'd just pick out some common ones and why we think this might be happening. So let's start with baby boomers. We're going to pick 3 triggers. The first, I think it's easy for boomers to feel disrespected or dismissed. I think there's a eye-rolling, okay boomer meme out there. And I think why this might be a trigger is boomers have spent decades building experience, and they equate experience with authority. So I think being sidelined makes them feel erased. And so this idea of if you are making a boomer feel disrespected or dismissed, this is why it's such a trigger for them. And we're going to get into maybe some ideas to resolve that. Another trigger is overemphasizing change without honoring legacy. Why is this a trigger? Well, because boomers were a part of building the systems that are currently in place. And so when they're criticized or scrapped too quickly, it feels really personal. And I think this is the whole work from home dynamic, right? When you erase a workplace in-person culture, you're dismantling the very social structure that I've put in place to create connection, belonging, and bonding. And conflict trigger number 3, which I was mentored by boomers in the workplace in the 2000s. So I have adopted this trigger as a Gen Xer. Informal communication that feels too casual. And I was telling a funny story of in workplace settings, I always introduce myself with my first and last name. I always say, I'm Lisa's son. I never say I'm Lisa. And that's because Nora Ephron in You've Got Mail had a whole thing around, you can't be a generation of cocktail waitresses. You have a first name and a last name. So I would say the reason boomers feel this is a trigger is they came up in a culture where formality equals respect. Those are 3 simple triggers and why we think there are triggers. To resolve this, we've got a couple of ideas. We have to acknowledge legacy and expertise. I think there's a really important moment where you can just make sure that's true. In my book, we found that women over the age of 50 were the most powerful in the data set. And every time I say that to an audience or say that to somebody, I get cheers, like people cheer because I think there's a sense of being overlooked or being sidelined as part of growth. Direct face-to-face conversations. I know this might make some of the generations uncomfortable, but when you seek a personal interaction, it could be simple as a coffee date. Claire and my team sent me a great Instagram post about some companies are offering $100 professional development budget where you can just do anything to create connection. It could be, let's go get a cup of coffee. Let's go get a manicure. Let's take a class together. I love that idea. And clear structure and follow-up. I really think boomers appreciate that email that says, here's what I heard. Here's what I think we need to do next. I think there is a respect for structure and follow-up that really speaks well to this generation. Our quick tip for de-escalating. Your experience here really matters to me. I'd love to hear how you would approach this. And I think when you say that with genuine appreciation and curiosity for that person's expertise and time, it really works. I also think in terms of building connection, invite them to share how they got their stories. Like, tell me some moments that really shaped your career. I think context builds trust. I love using that $100 budget that companies might provide to pair a boomer with a Gen Zer for reverse mentoring as well. Because if you can show me how to use my phone, I'll be very happy. My mom loves anyone who shows her a trick on her phone. And acknowledging their contributions in creating the structure. I think those are all ways to think about it. Gen X, which is my generation, and I do, by the way, all these triggers make sense to me. The first is micromanagement or lack of autonomy. And I think this generation literally raised themselves. Like literally, I was a latchkey kid, right? Both my parents worked and we would microwave. I always say that on the Amtrak, I love that microwave hamburger, the cheeseburger in the cafe car, because my parents would go to Price Club, now known as Costco, and buy like a 24 pack of those. And when I got home from school, I would microwave myself a cheeseburger. So every time I eat it, it's like Marcel Proust's Madeleine cookie. It reminds me of my childhood. But we thrive on independence. And so we don't like to be micromanaged. The second is feeling underappreciated or invisible. I think we're sandwiched between 2 very strong generations. And so we're often overlooked despite the fact that we've been carrying the load and getting the work done. And I think one of my triggers is bureaucracy or performative leadership. And I think we value practicality. Sometimes corporate theater or corporate Kool-Aid might grate on my instincts. So what I value, and I put myself in this generation, no nonsense, solution first conversations. I'm always like, jump to the point. How do we fix this? Agency, autonomy, and recognizing the role that I play as a foundation, a foundational glue, and a stabilizing force. So I think if you're working with someone in the Gen Xer generation, I would say your de-escalation tip is, you've seen a version of this before. What do you think we're missing out on? And you can ask them to be team moderators. They thrive when they're translating between the extremes, recognizing them publicly so we're not forgotten. I think those are all parts of this generation's needs and wants. All right, millennials, here are my 3 content triggers. 1, a lack of transparency or feedback. And I think why, I think there is a deep desire to make sure I understand why we're doing something, being included. And when there isn't transparency or feedback, it's hard for, I think, a millennial to feel their purpose or feel aligned with an overall purpose. And so I think clarity equals a sense of security that I've bet on the right thing to be excited about or passionate about. The second is dismissiveness. If you dismiss work-life balance, I think millennials are incredibly helpful in terms of introducing this concept. I think they watch their parents burn out, frankly, and they're trying to do differently and not be punished for it. The third is being labeled entitled. I imagine every millennial hates this when they're labeled as entitled, because I know a bunch who are not. And they've had to prove themselves in a world that changed the rules on them. Student debt, housing crisis, there's so many things that they've gone through, 9/11, recessions. And I do think they have weathered some storms, and I think we need to take away that label of entitlement. How we resolve this? Honest two-way conversations. I think the greatest thing you can do is like, can I be open with you? Recognizing purpose and growth and including in decision-making, even when you feel like you have more expertise or wisdom than they do. And that was a Gen Xer thing for me to say, by the way. So I would say just making sure there is a sense of purpose and inclusion. I think the de-escalation tip that I would offer here is, can we talk through what didn't work and how we can grow from it together? And I think the phrase grow from it together really matters. Here's some bridge building tips. Please invite them to share their why. I think that is a huge motivating factor for someone in this generation. Give feedback and ask for it. It's a two-way street, and I'm really open about asking for feedback. Gen Zers. All right, Gen Zers. Let's talk about the conflict triggers. The first is if there's a perceived condescension or hierarchy. I think this is really interesting. And I think this generation was raised to question systems, believe in equality or equity, and not having to pay dues without reason. And I think that we should acknowledge that this is the trigger. Another one, which I think almost blends from the millennials, is not feeling heard or included. And so I think this generations have always had a platform like social media to share their voice. So they don't want to be silenced. I think being silenced feels unnatural. And the last one is a conflict trigger is if they feel a lack of authenticity in leadership. So I really think they value realness over polish. They can see through things. And if it feels fake, they disengage. What they value, if you're going to work with someone who's a Gen Zer, psychological safety. I think that's a big component of it. Transparent and conversational tones. And I think that's hard for me sometimes because I do love I do think formal professional interactions are a sign of respect. So I've learned that. But for me, I do enforce it in things like emails, like anything that is an end product, a work product. I do feel strongly about that. But in our interactions, there can be a more conversational tone and a sense of fairness and shared agency. One de-escalation tip I will give you is, hey, here's what's happening on my end. How did that feel to you? Because I think as we build bridges with this generation, we want to have them help us shape culture and not just consume it or destroy it. I think we should ask them to be a part of how we shape things, especially in a digitally native world. I think there is a fluency that I don't naturally have that I really rely on people who are a millennial or Gen Zer to do. Invite them into the conversation early to build trust. While they may not be the final decision maker, I want to hear the point of view. In fact, in scripting this episode for the podcast, we actually all had a conversation in the morning touch base, and I asked Emerson lots of questions to make sure that this felt authentic to her, and share the why behind the what, because I think context and impact really makes a difference. Each generation's trigger helps you understand where they're coming from. And I think that's how we go from conflict to connection. When we meet misunderstanding with curiosity instead of control or dismissiveness, trust is reimagined. I personally like this idea of having cross-generational collaboration opportunities, whether it's mentoring pods, a story circle where we ask folks from different generations to share formative work stories and reflect on what's changed or what they want to have changed, and maybe even a communication norms workshop where each team member gets a chance to explain their preferred mode of communication and why. We used to do this at McKinsey a lot, where we would have team learnings, and that created a really great team rhythm when we were forming the dynamics. Having all 4 generations in the workplace can be a real asset. I think there is a successful path forward when we get the best of each generation. And I'd love to hear what's going on in your workplace. So please send us a message in confidence at gravitasnewyork.com. Share a message with us on social media. I'd love to hear what are some of the things you're going through too. Thank you for joining us for this episode of In Confidence. I hope you're leaving this space stronger than when you entered it. If you love this episode, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe so you never miss a moment of inspiration. And until next time, in the words of my 9-year-old self, I see you, I value you, and I believe in you. This is In Confidence.